Greetings everyone, today I'll be testing out Samyang's 24mm f1.4 lens. This is one of the most difficult and expensive full-frame lenses for any lens manufacturer to make due to the combination of a very wide angle of 24mm and a very fast aperture of f1.4. The 24mm focal length is great on both full-frame and APS-C cameras. On expensive full-frame cameras, 24mm is a popular and very wide-angle focal length, especially useful in wedding photography. It's wide-angle enough to give you pretty dramatic pictures without going too far into the stretched corners of ultra-wide-angle territory. And, as you can see here, it's not so wide-angle that you can't still get an out-of-focus background. However, if you're using an APS-C digital camera, then this lens will be the equivalent of about 38mm, and that's a fantastic focal length for more general purpose photography. It's an angle of view that's wide enough to catch the bigger picture, but zoomed in just enough to emphasize your subject a bit more. So, whatever camera you have, this could be a super useful lens. The real talking point though is this lens's f1.4 maximum aperture. It can let in a huge amount of light for nighttime or indoor photography, and the f1.4 maximum aperture can also give you a really out-of-focus background. Especially on a full-frame camera, this lens can give you amazing wide-angle portraits with out-of-focus, wide backgrounds. That is a unique and special ability for any lens to have, and you normally have to pay for it. Canon and Nikon's equivalent lenses, which are great but by no means perfect, cost well over £1,000. This Samyang version is about £500, less than half the price. If the quality turns out to be good enough, then this could be a lens that really opens things up for a lot of photographers. So it's potentially quite an exciting and seriously fun piece of kit. Well, let's take a look at its build quality. The lens is quite big, but not too heavy, and it's built to Samyang's normal high standards, feeling quite solid. The most noteworthy thing is that this is a manual focus lens, but that's not too much of a problem as it's quite wide angle and the focus ring is extremely smooth and precise to use. It's a little tricky to focus the lens using your camera's viewfinder, but it's very easy if you use live view and check on your camera's screen. You control the lens's aperture using an aperture ring, which clicks at every half aperture stop, although it jumps from f1.4 to f2, and then later from f16 to f22. Samyang also make a cine version of this lens with a smooth aperture ring and tracks for a follow focus rig, if you're more professionally into video work. As usual for a lens of this kind, it does not have image stabilization. The lens accepts 77mm filters without any problems, and it comes with quite a deep lens hood. All in all, the lens is built very nicely, it's easy to use, and frankly, you don't really miss autofocus too much. As I've mentioned already, this really is one of the hardest types of lens for manufacturers to design, so let's see if Samyang could come up with the necessary image quality. We'll start by testing it on a full-frame camera, a 20MP Canon 6D. With the aperture wide open at f1.4, sharpness levels in the middle of the image are good, although we see slightly low contrast. Well, let's look in those troublesome corners. Surprisingly, sharpness in the corners is also good, and chromatic aberration levels seem quite under control. That's a pretty praiseworthy performance for such a fast, wide-angle lens. Stop the lens down to f2 for a little more sharpness and brightness in those corners, and back in the middle, the image quality becomes fairly sharp, with much improved contrast levels. Stop the aperture down again to f2.8 and the image quality leaps up to fantastic levels in the middle of the image with perfect sharpness and very punchy contrast levels. The corners of the image also look fantastic. This is a great performance. Image quality remains fantastic if you stop down further, even all the way down to f16. So the lens performs well on a full-frame camera. At f1.4 the image quality is good for a lens of this kind, and surprisingly nice in the corners of the image. And the Samyang lens quickly becomes spectacular when you stop down the aperture a bit. All in all, a very satisfying performance. Okay, let's challenge the lens a little more by putting it on an APS-C camera, in this case my 20 megapixel Canon 70D. At f1.4 the image quality is usable in the middle of the frame, but a little soft with some low contrast levels. Thankfully the corners are still okay, and even on the APS-C camera we're not seeing much chromatic aberration. Stop the lens down to f2 and the corners are a little better, and picture quality in the middle of the frame becomes fairly good. However, stop the lens down to f2.8 and just like on a full frame camera, there's a sudden jump in image quality. The lens becomes super sharp with very punchy images from the middle right into the corners of the image. This is great image quality for any lens at f2.8. Even stopped all the way down to f11, the lens remains this sharp, although from f16 the image gets a little softer because of diffraction, which is normal for any lens on an APS-C camera. So overall, on a cropped sensor APS-C camera, the lens becomes very sharp very quickly when you stop the aperture down. It could have been sharper at f1.4, but for a lens of this type it's actually giving pretty clean images. Okay, so let's look at distortion and vignetting. Neither are a problem on APS-C cameras, which is useful, so let's look at the performance on a full frame camera. The lens displays some moderate barrel distortion, and at f1.4 there is very strong vignetting or darkness in the corners. However, to be fair, that level of vignetting is completely normal for this kind of fast, wide-angle lens. Even Canon and Nikon's best lenses will behave like this. Stop the lens down to f2 for brighter corners, and at f2.8 the vignetting isn't really noticeable anymore. The lens can focus as close as 25 cm, which is reasonably near for some close-up fun photography. Thankfully the close-up image quality is fine, even with the aperture opened up to f1.4. Stop the lens down to f2 and again to f2.8 for even more sharpness. When you're shooting against bright lights, you get some pretty noticeable flaring. Again, that is normal for this kind of lens. Portrait photographers often use this to their advantage, especially when shooting in the evening at the magic hour. Finally, as I've mentioned, this lens can give you very out of focus backgrounds, and the good news is that the quality of its bokeh is very nice indeed, especially for such a wide angle lens. As you can see here, the out of focus highlights are rendered extremely smoothly, melting away into the background. For many professional photographers, this characteristic is absolutely vital. It's great to see such lovely bokeh on a wide angle lens. Okay, well, let's sum everything up. For people using an APS-C camera, this is simply a very nice and useful lens, both for everyday photography and for catching those special shots. On an APS-C sensor, it's not the sharpest lens in the world at f1.4, but it's giving you such a wide aperture and very nice images to boot, so it's a very nice lens to have if you don't mind manual focus. However, the lens really comes to life on a full frame camera, like a lot of camera lenses. That dramatic 24mm wide angle, combined with the f1.4 aperture, is a rare and enticing combination which can give you unique and beautiful pictures. The Canon and Nikon versions of this lens may be slightly sharper in the middle of their images at f1.4, but the Samyang lens is just as good as them in pretty much every other way, and it costs less than half the price. It's a genuinely important lens for wedding photography, and all the other dramatic pictures it can give you are really fun. It's a very nice, very useful camera lens indeed, and owners of full-frame cameras should particularly consider it. I certainly had a great time testing it out. Recommended.